Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight we're going to take a very brief look at the history of gardens. And we're not talking about farmland or anything like that. We're talking specifically about domestic gardens. So who were the first people to have a domestic garden? Who was the first person to, for example, landscape the garden, put some flowers in and that sort of thing? Well, the interesting fact is it really stems from the Roman period. As most things do, we often assume that civilization begins with the Romans, really. So I'll show you a picture. This is one of the pictures that we use when we do a talk on the history of gardening. Usually we bring out lots and lots of props as well, things like gardening tools from the past. As you know, we do have a habit of collecting all sorts of things, all sorts of historical things. So that's our first garden, and I'll just talk a little bit about it. A lot of them were gardens that were actually set within a household. So in a way, I always describe it as looking very much like a cloistered garden in a cathedral. So you often have the house and all the rooms surrounding an inner garden. However, saying that, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes you would have the house, the property, on one site, and then the gardens coming away from it. Sometimes with a front garden, sometimes with a back garden. But that is a stereotypical Roman garden within what looks like a courtyard building, really. They generally have a water feature. Once again, not always, but they often have a water feature, and it's very manicured. And the best way of explaining that is the planting system is all within beds. And one of the big things that you often think of when you think of Romans, and in particular garden design, is you often have things like statues, which is in the way how the Victorians copy garden design later on when you get to famous properties. For example, Brodsworth Hall, that's owned by English Heritage, or Croom Park. You often get statues. So this is your standard Roman garden. Now, we could talk all day just specifically about Roman gardens. However, as we're only limiting ourselves to about a 15-minute video, we're going to go and do a whistle-stop tour of gardens. Now, we don't really have very ornate gardens after the Romans, really. You have to remember the early medieval period is a period of turmoil, and there's a lot of wars, there's a lot of problems. We've got invasions by the Jutes, the Angles, the Anglo-Saxons, the Saxons. So we don't really have garden design. We're literally living in settlements and growing our own produce, but that's pretty much it. Then when you get to the medieval era, you then have a little bit of garden design going on. And what you see here is a very practical garden, but also a showy garden, also a garden that looks nice, really. So very much like the Roman style. So not just for practical purposes, but also a garden that looks good. What we would now call landscape gardens. You do see a individual looking after the flowers and the crops that are growing in there. And you see this, what looks like worm work going all the way around. That's actually wicker work, so very much like you'd make a wattle and daub wall. And it was quite a common feature of a lot of garden wattle work, and it is very popular even today. I know several people that use these for fences, for example. Very, very useful, and you can make your own. But you will notice in that picture a mixture of things. We've got flowers, we've got produce, we've also got trees, and in particular trees that are growing fruit, like the ones in the centre there. Like most medieval drawings and illustrations, there is no real care for proportion. So you do often see, for example, some features in the garden larger than the actual people in there. But I will also draw your attention to the water feature, which I think is interesting, because we always assume there is no such thing as those type of things in medieval gardens or later. And we've also got in the back there something that we had in a Monday mystery, which are the bee skeps, and these were used for honey. So this is more of an upper class garden, someone that's going to have leisure time to sit in the garden, whereas most people only had a garden that was growing things like vegetables, certain fruit, and more importantly, a space for a pig maybe. And also another quite important thing with a lot of medieval gardens is a herb garden, and obviously the herbs were used for culinary purposes as a type of seasoning, and they were also used for medicine as well, medicinal herbs. So we've got a pretty practical garden, but looking good. Now when we get to the end of the medieval period, and definitely into the 16th century, definitely into the Tudor period, garden design explodes really, and there are some fantastic gardens being produced. And if you ever go to another English heritage property, Kenilworth, you'll be able to see there Elizabeth I garden that was put in. And one of the greatest things that you'll find with that is a lot of hedging. Tall hedges, so it makes areas private within your garden, a certain degree of planting, but hedges appear a lot. And this is a stereotypical Tudor garden, and these low hedges produce what is often referred to as a labyrinth, not quite a maze, but a labyrinth, and is a knot garden, and people often say they resemble knots, lots and lots of knots, and from high up you will be able to see them. And that's really interesting because you often have things like a snail's mound, often referred to as a snail's mound, or even wooden platforms, so people can actually stand up and look down at their garden. But by the Tudor period, most people, your average person, was still growing the vegetables. They still had a pig, they still have herbs growing. But if you were a member of the upper classes, the ultimate would be to have this knot garden design. Very stereotypical when you get to the end of the medieval period and into the 16th century. Now, when you get to the 18th century, that continues to a certain degree, and it becomes a certain taste that has that old-fashioned feel to it. However, you do now get a lot of people that specialise in garden design, and one of the most famous people that I'm sure you are waiting to hear about, purely because if you're talking about gardens you've got to mention him, is this man here. Now, I'm sure everyone knows who that is. That is Lancelot Brown, or Capability Brown, as he was often referred, because he was a very capable man. And this man appears in the 18th century, and he is someone, not the only person, but someone that really takes garden design as a specialist subject. For example, if he was on Mastermind, he would take garden design as a specialist subject. And what he wanted to change is many things really. One of the big things was he wanted to stop boundaries. So whereas you've seen a walled garden in a Roman building like a villa, and you've also seen the hedgerows that were used, or the wickerwork going around a medieval garden, he wanted to get rid of all that. He said you don't really need to have boundaries. You can actually tell your neighbours or any guests coming round that everything they can see belongs to you, and in a way you're not lying. So he was one of those who decided to have nature as being part of your back garden. So even if your garden ends here and the rest is a field, it will look as if your garden is part of that field. So it looks as if you own a vast amount of land. And he used lots and lots of tricks with that. Instead of having hedges, walls and things like that, one of the standard and typical ways of having a boundary without having a boundary was the invention of, for example, the ha-ha, where you would have a ditch around your garden, around your property, backed up or supported with a brick wall, and your garden would be here. There would be this ditch, and then the field owned by someone else maybe. And the thing is, you won't see that ditch. And some people often say that's one of the reasons why it's called a ha-ha, because people walk along, fall into it, and everyone has a right old laugh at you falling down that ditch. But in a way, if you stand back, you will see landscape. You won't actually see a boundary as such. Here's a few other little tips There's a nice little illustration there showing what's pretty much going on really. So nature, your garden and the landscape is all in one. He did have a habit, or a lot of 18th century landscape gardeners did have a habit of altering the landscape. For example, huge amounts of earth was often moved. Marshland was often drained, and a perfect example of that is in Worcestershire at Croom Park. A large culverting system went in to actually drain a lot of the land, to actually make it good garden, landscape garden, and not just marshland that can't be used. The other thing as well is they often altered the course of rivers, or blocked rivers up, or created what is often huge lakes that look like a river but they're actually just a lake. So the Serpentine Lake, as they were often called, and a lot of water features. But the other thing as well, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and this is something they did at Croom Park, is the view that you look at if you're doing a walk of the gardens is the view that the landscape gardeners wanted you to see. So if you walk around and you get a glimpse of the house, you're getting a glimpse of the house because the landscape gardener wanted you to see it. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. A good probably 10 years ago now, the National Trust actually replanted a large amount of trees and bushes at Croom Park in the places they were on the landscape plan. So they've actually put the bushes and trees back to where they are, and that is quite a fascinating thing because they use GPS and all sorts of things, so they're in the exact place where Capability Brown would have wanted them. So when you do see, for example, the view of Croom Court, or you see the Serpentine Lake and that sort of thing, they are the views that Capability Brown, that man there, would have wanted you to see. But the interesting thing is he's not the only one. So there's a lot of people in the 18th century changing gardens forever. The poor people usually got moved. It's quite famous that landscape gardeners often moved entire villages just so the view would not be spoilt from the lord of the manor's house. For example, when he's having breakfast, you don't want to look at the poor people's houses at the bottom of the valley. So they literally moved them. Shocking, as you can imagine. But then when we get into the Victorian era, gardens change again. And you've only got to go to places like Brodsworth Hall to see typical Victorian gardens. Sometimes a walled garden, sometimes very practical with a kitchen garden. But you also get lots of hedges, topiary, lots of flowers, borders, lots and lots of shrubs growing, and the gardens look very neat and controlled, very different to the landscape that Capability Brown and other 18th century gardeners had, where the garden doesn't end, it becomes nature, it becomes wild basically. So that's your typical Victorian one. But when you get to the Victorians, some people started having a typical vegetable plot for the lower classes. Shame, because a lot of people lived on top of each other in slums, for example, so they didn't even have a garden. But those of the very upper classes could make use of the latest technology. And there was a lot happening by the Victorian era, including rollers, including things like lawn mowers. A huge amount was being done to make gardening a bit more of a leisure activity, because you have to remember, in days gone by, if you had grass, it had to be scythed, it had to be cut with shears, but things like a lawnmower coming in made it much easier. Victorians were also keen on getting the latest trees and plants from abroad, and we know for a fact some ships would go abroad and they would bring back actually mature trees that would be loaded onto ships and then planted directly into gardens. And a lot of Victorians would make a lot or spend a lot of money. And a perfect example of that is a bill of sale, or a receipt there. And as you can see from the bottom, if you can, it cost £1, 3 shilling and 6pence for a big order of plants from, in particular, this Thackeray florist. So they were spending a lot of money. The Victorians were really into looking at beauty in the gardens. And then post-Victorian period, so when we start getting into the 1900s, the start of the 20th century, there was a lot of clubs and societies. The Victorians started them originally, but there was a lot of clubs and societies that people joined. And we've got here the annual dinner of the National Chrysanthemum Society, which I'm amazed that I could actually say the word, because usually I can't say the word, so it came out amazingly. I'm not going to trial fate by saying it again, but there was a lot of organisations specifying or specifically looking at certain plants. And I haven't even mentioned the tulip craze that took place earlier in history, really. But like I said, this is only a whistle-stop tour. Then you get a lot of magazines that people are subscribing to, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, including the Amateur Gardener. And this is literally a leaflet that you could pick up at a shop selling flowers, and you might go, oh, I might get that, really. A penny, that's all, every Saturday, which has all sorts of information for the amateur gardener, because now it is becoming quite common to have a nice garden, not just with vegetables and herbs growing in it, but also flowers. And like I said, people were joining all these different societies. The biggest change came in 1939, or shall we say actually in the Great War. In the Great War, and then later on in 1939, gardens had to change dramatically because people, under the Defence of the Realm Act, or later on under the Dig for Victory slogan, people had to grow their own. So a lot of gardeners did dig up their flower beds, did dig up their lawns and start planting vegetables. There's even some fantastic pictures showing the moat at the Tower of London, which is just grass, it's dry, and that was all dug up, and they had all sorts of gardens, all sorts of flower beds and vegetables growing in there, all to help with the war effort. And a little interesting leaflet is this one that came out in the war, in the Second World War this time. And it's really telling you grow for winter as well as summer. And it's an absolutely fantastic leaflet because it shows you when you should be growing vegetables and when they are ready to dig out of the ground. And I find that fascinating today because in the modern day, most of the vegetables that we eat are available all year round. And it's leaflets like that that really go to show that things were in season as such. Nowadays, we eat strawberries, for example, even in the winter. But then when we get to the end of the Second World War and into the 1950s, which is the period that we always stop with, really, most people had a leisure garden. Most people had a lawn. Usually you would hear the lawnmower being pushed across the lawn in the summer, for example. It's a sound that I always remember about my childhood. It's not only a bee buzzing past your ear in the summer, it's the noise of the lawnmower, but not the electric lawnmower, the push lawnmower. Woolworths also brought out a catalogue. This is a nice little guide, but it's got lots and lots of adverts in here for all sorts of things like fertilizer for your lawns. And you've only got to look at the picture on the front there that leisure gardens were back in, practical, but also places you could sit in a deck chair and relax in over the summer holidays, for example. Anyway, that's a brief, and I mean brief, whistle-stop tour in the history of gardens. And if you do want a specific video on Roman gardening or anything like that, let us know. Subscribe, let us know on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Stay safe, stay in, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.